During a routine night shift, a policeman notices a young black girl in the backseat of a car, signaling SOS with her hands. Deciding to follow up on what he saw, he uncovers something that leaves him in complete shock. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Share this video with your friends and family. The night was heavy, a thick blanket of darkness broken only by the occasional flicker of distant headlights or the muted glow of scattered streetlights along the deserted highway. Officer Daniel Rivers had always found these late shifts oddly comforting. There was something about the quiet that gave him space to think. His cruiser hummed steadily beneath him as he drove, the dashboard lights casting faint shadows across his face. The radio crackled now and then with updates from dispatch, but otherwise the world seemed asleep. It was a routine patrol, a stretch of road notorious for its long, empty miles and the occasional reckless driver. Daniel's mind drifted as he scanned the darkness, his thoughts trailing to his own life, one that felt equally barren. His divorce was finalized just months ago, leaving an aching void where his family had once been. His teenage daughter barely spoke to him now, her silence more piercing than any argument they'd ever had. He glanced at the photograph clipped to the visor, a picture of her, smiling brightly in a summer dress, back when things had been easier. The sight of her youthful joy contrasted sharply with the weight of his reality, and he sighed, focusing back on the road. That's when he noticed it. A pair of headlights in the distance, their beam erratic, weaving slightly. Daniel frowned, his instincts sharpening. A drunk driver? Someone distracted? Either way, they were a hazard, and he couldn't ignore it. He flipped on his lights, the red and blue cutting through the night as he accelerated toward the vehicle. As he approached, the car slowed obediently, pulling to the shoulder. Daniel parked his cruiser a few feet behind, adjusting his hat and stepping out into the crisp night air. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked toward the driver's side. His flashlight illuminated the interior, revealing a white man in his 40s gripping the steering wheel. His face was pale, drawn with dark circles under his eyes that suggested exhaustion. In the back seat sat a young girl, no older than 10, her wide eyes staring back at him like those of a startled animal. "Good evening," Daniel began, his voice steady and professional. "You were weaving a bit back there. Everything all right?" The man gave a tired smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, sorry about that. Just a long night. We're heading home." Daniel's gaze shifted to the girl. She was buckled in, clutching a small, worn teddy bear. Her skin was a deep brown, contrasting with the man's pale complexion. Her hair was tightly curled, and though she was silent, her eyes spoke volumes. Fear, unease, and something else he couldn't quite place. "License and registration, please," Daniel said, keeping his tone neutral. The man nodded, fumbling in the glove compartment before handing over the documents. "Name's Michael Harrison," he said. "This is my daughter, Amara." Daniel studied the paperwork under the beam of his flashlight. Everything seemed in order. Valid license, up-to-date registration, no outstanding warrants. Still, something gnawed at him. The girl hadn't said a word, and her gaze remained fixed on him, unblinking. "Amara," Daniel said gently, leaning slightly to catch her attention. "Are you okay?" Before the girl could respond, Michael interjected. "She's just tired. We've had a long day visiting family. You know how kids get." Daniel straightened, his eyes narrowing slightly as he regarded Michael. The man's smile seemed forced, and his hands gripped the steering wheel a little too tightly. There was tension here, something unspoken but palpable. "I'll be right back," Daniel said, taking the documents and walking back to his cruiser. Sitting behind the wheel of his patrol car, Daniel ran Michael's information through the system. Everything checked out. No criminal record, no outstanding tickets. By all accounts, Michael Harrison was an ordinary man on an ordinary night. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He looked up at the car ahead, his gaze settling on the girl. She was staring out the window now, her hands fidgeting with the bear in her lap. Her movements were small, deliberate, almost rhythmic. It was then that he noticed her fingers, tapping, folding, moving in patterns. His heart skipped a beat as recognition dawned. It wasn't random fidgeting. She was signing something. SOS. The realization hit him like a jolt of electricity. The universal distress signal spelled out in the silent language of her hands. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened. What was happening here? Why would this girl be signaling for help? He glanced back at the computer. Nothing in Michael's record indicated he was dangerous, but records didn't always tell the full story. Daniel took a deep breath, his training keeping him steady. He had no evidence of wrongdoing, no reason to detain them, but he couldn't ignore the silent plea from the girl. He had to be careful. Returning to the car, he handed the documents back to Michael. "Everything checks out," he said, his tone calm but measured. "Drive safely and make sure to get some rest." Michael nodded, relief flickering across his face. "Thanks, officer, we will." Daniel stepped back, watching as the car pulled onto the road and disappeared into the darkness. He climbed back into his cruiser, but didn't start the engine right away. His instincts screamed at him to do more. The girl's silent SOS was burned into his mind, a call for help that he couldn't ignore. Flipping off his headlights, Daniel pulled onto the road, maintaining a safe distance as he followed the car. If something was wrong, he needed to know. The cruiser's engine hummed quietly as Daniel kept a safe distance behind the car ahead. His own headlights dimmed to avoid drawing attention. His mind churned with possibilities, each more troubling than the last. What had prompted the girl to signal for help? Was Michael her father, as he claimed, or was he something far more sinister? There was no denying the fear in her eyes or the deliberate nature of her gestures. SOS. A silent cry in the darkness. The highway stretched out endlessly before them, the monotony of the asphalt broken only by the occasional streetlight. Daniel noted the car's steady pace now, the erratic swerves from earlier gone. Perhaps Michael had been startled by the traffic stop and was now focusing harder on the road. Or perhaps something deeper had changed, something that Daniel couldn't see yet. He glanced at the dashboard clock. It was nearing midnight, and the road remained eerily empty. The car ahead suddenly flicked its right blinker on, turning onto a narrower road that led toward a less populated area. Daniel hesitated, knowing his continued presence might eventually be noticed, but the memory of Amara's pleading eyes made his decision clear. He followed, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. The side road was darker, flanked by dense trees that seemed to loom closer with every passing mile. Daniel kept his cruiser at a steady speed, far enough back to remain inconspicuous. He watched the taillights ahead, their glow like twin beacons leading him deeper into the unknown. A few minutes later, Michael's car began to slow. Daniel's breath hitched as he eased up on the gas, ready to stop if necessary. The vehicle veered onto the shoulder, coming to a halt. Daniel quickly turned onto a small gravel path just off the road, positioning his cruiser out of sight, but with a clear view of the stopped car. He cut the engine, plunging the area into near silence save for the faint rustle of wind through the trees. Michael stepped out of the car, his movements sluggish and unsteady. He walked around to the passenger's side, opening the door and leaning in. Daniel couldn't see what he was doing but strained his ears for any sound. A muffled voice, perhaps Michael's, drifted toward him, though he couldn't make out the words. Amara didn't move. She remained in the back seat, her small form barely visible in the dim light. Her stillness was unsettling, a stark contrast to Michael's restless pacing. After a few moments, Michael closed the door and returned to the driver's side. He hesitated, gripping the door frame as if steadying himself. Then he climbed back in, and the car's headlights flared back to life. Daniel waited until the vehicle was back on the road before restarting his own car and following once more. The tension in his chest grew tighter with each passing mile. Something was wrong. He could feel it. Yet he had no concrete evidence, nothing that would hold up if he chose to intervene. The law was clear. He couldn't act on instinct alone, but that didn't mean he would turn a blind eye. The road narrowed further, winding through a sparsely populated area marked by scattered houses, most of them dark and quiet. The car ahead began to slow again, eventually pulling into the driveway of a small, weathered house at the edge of a wooded lot. Daniel stopped his cruiser a safe distance away, partially obscured by the shadows of overhanging branches. The house was modest, its paint peeling and shutters hanging at odd angles. The driveway was overgrown with weeds, the gravel nearly indistinguishable beneath the encroaching grass. The single porch light cast a dim glow, barely illuminating the front door. Michael and Amara exited the car. She clutched her teddy bear tightly, her small figure dwarfed by his looming presence. Michael placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the house. She moved reluctantly, her steps hesitant. Daniel's gut twisted at the sight. The pair disappeared inside, and the porch light flicked off, leaving the house in darkness. Daniel sat in his cruiser, his mind racing. He knew he couldn't approach the house without justification, but the uneasy feeling gnawed at him, refusing to be ignored. His radio crackled, startling him. It was dispatch, checking in. Daniel hesitated before responding, keeping his voice steady as he confirmed his status. He considered calling for backup, but dismissed the idea almost immediately. Without evidence, he couldn't justify such an action. He was on his own. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Daniel's patience was tested, but he refused to leave. He kept his eyes trained on the house, looking for any sign of movement. The stillness was oppressive, the silence deafening. Finally, a light flickered on in one of the upstairs windows. The faint glow silhouetted two figures, Michael and Amara. They stood close together, the man's posture towering over the girl. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he watched. Michael appeared to be speaking, his gestures animated, while Amara remained still. The scene was too far away for Daniel to discern details, but the tension was palpable even from his vantage point. Then, suddenly, the light went out. Daniel's heart raced. Every instinct screamed at him to act, but his training held him back. He couldn't storm into the house without cause. Still, the image of Amara's small frame against Michael's imposing figure lingered in his mind, a haunting reminder of her silent plea. Moments later, the front door opened. Michael stepped onto the porch, his movements deliberate. He lit a cigarette, the glowing ember casting faint light on his face. He appeared calmer now, more composed, though Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that it was a facade. After a few minutes, Michael stubbed out the cigarette and returned inside, locking the door behind him. The house fell dark once more, leaving Daniel alone with his thoughts. He knew he couldn't stay here forever, but the unease rooted him in place. He decided to wait a little longer, just in case. His eyes scanned the house, the driveway, the surrounding woods. He was looking for anything, a flicker of movement, a sound, a reason to step in. But the night remained still. The air felt heavy as Daniel remained parked near the shadowed house, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an hour. He couldn't shake the image of Amara's small, motionless figure silhouetted in the upstairs window. Her silent SOS echoed in his mind, each gesture a haunting reminder that she believed she was in danger. A part of him wanted to march up to the door, knock, and demand answers, but his training held him back. There was no evidence, no probable cause to justify such an action. All he had was instinct, and instincts weren't admissible in court. Still, his gut told him to stay, to watch, and to wait. Just as he contemplated how long he could linger without raising suspicion, the house suddenly came alive again. The porch light flickered on, and the front door opened. Daniel leaned forward, his pulse quickening. Michael appeared, his silhouette backlit by the warm glow of the interior. Amara followed close behind, her head bowed, her teddy bear clutched tightly to her chest. Michael guided her toward the car, his hand resting heavily on her shoulder. She moved slowly, almost reluctantly. Daniel's jaw tightened as he watched the two climb back into the vehicle. The engine roared to life, and the car backed out of the driveway, its taillights disappearing into the darkness. Daniel waited a beat before starting his cruiser. He switched off the headlights, creeping out of his hiding spot and maintaining a safe distance as he followed them back onto the main road. The night felt darker now, the absence of streetlights turning the stretch of highway into a black tunnel. The only signs of life were the faint glow of Michael's taillights ahead and the hum of Daniel's own engine. The car ahead seemed steady at first, its movements controlled and predictable. But soon, Daniel noticed subtle signs of erratic behavior, small swerves to the left, then to the right. The vehicle's speed fluctuated, slowing almost to a crawl before jerking forward again. Daniel's heart sank. Something was wrong. He flipped on his dashboard camera, ensuring everything was recorded. His instincts screamed at him to act, but he held back, hoping Michael would correct his course. The road ahead curved sharply, the kind of turn that demanded a steady hand. Michael's car didn't adjust. Instead, it veered wide, skidding onto the shoulder. "Damn it," Daniel muttered, slamming his cruiser into gear and flipping on his lights. But before he could close the distance, Michael's car swerved sharply back onto the road, tires screeching as it overcorrected. The vehicle spun, its headlights flashing wildly before careening off the pavement and into a shallow ditch. There was a sickening crunch of metal as the front end collided with a weathered utility pole. Daniel's training kicked in instantly. He radioed for backup and an ambulance as he pulled to a stop behind the wreckage. Grabbing his flashlight, he bolted from the cruiser, the cold night air biting at his face. His boots pounded against the asphalt as he approached the crumpled car, his heart racing with a mix of urgency and dread. The front of the car was a mangled mess of metal and glass. Smoke hissed from the engine, curling upward into the night. Daniel shone his flashlight into the driver's seat. Michael was slumped forward, his head resting against the steering wheel. Blood trickled down his temple, staining the collar of his shirt. "Sir, can you hear me?" Daniel shouted, his voice cutting through the stillness. Michael groaned faintly, but didn't lift his head. Daniel's flashlight moved to the back seat. Amara sat frozen, her seatbelt still fastened. Her wide eyes stared at him, glistening with tears. The teddy bear she clung to earlier was now wedged between her and the door. Her small hands trembled as she reached up, fumbling with the seatbelt buckle. "Hold on, sweetheart. I've got you," Daniel said, his tone softening. He yanked open the back door, the metal groaning in protest. Amara flinched but didn't resist as he reached in. Her seatbelt had jammed, refusing to release her. Daniel cursed under his breath, pulling out a small utility knife from his belt. "Close your eyes," he instructed gently, cutting through the fabric with a swift motion. The strap fell away, and he lifted her out carefully, cradling her small frame against his chest. She buried her face in his shoulder, her body shaking with silent sobs. Daniel carried her a safe distance from the wreck before setting her down on the gravel shoulder. "Stay right here, okay?" he said, kneeling to her level. She nodded, clutching his arm for a moment before letting go. He returned to the car, his flashlight beam slicing through the smoke. Michael stirred as Daniel opened the driver's door. The man's eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. He mumbled something incoherent, his words slurring together. "Sir, I need you to stay with me," Daniel said, unbuckling Michael's seatbelt and carefully pulling him from the wreckage. The man's legs wobbled as Daniel supported him, guiding him away from the car. Michael's breathing was shallow, and his head lolled to the side as if he could barely stay conscious. "Amara?" Michael murmured, his voice barely audible. His eyes darted around, unfocused. "She's safe?" "She's fine," Daniel assured him, though his tone was firmer now. "But you're not. Sit down before you collapse." Daniel propped Michael against the cruiser, keeping a close watch as the man's head slumped forward again. The sound of sirens in the distance grew louder, a welcome relief. Amara remained where he had left her, her small frame hunched as she hugged her knees. Daniel crouched beside her, his voice soft. "The ambulance is almost here. You're safe now." Her tear-streaked face turned toward him, and for the first time she whispered, her voice so quiet it was barely audible, "Thank you." The words sent a jolt through Daniel. He offered a reassuring smile, though his mind raced with questions. What had happened tonight? What had driven Michael to this point? The ambulance arrived moments later, paramedics rushing to assess Michael's injuries. Daniel explained the situation briefly, his eyes never straying far from Amara. A second paramedic approached her, but she shrank away, her gaze darting to Daniel. "It's okay," he said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. "They're here to help." She nodded hesitantly, allowing the paramedic to check her over. Aside from minor bruises, she seemed physically unharmed. Emotionally, however, was another matter entirely. As the medics prepared to transport Michael to the hospital, Daniel made a quick call to Child Protective Services. Amara couldn't go with Michael in his condition, and she needed a safe place for the night. He hated the idea of separating them, but there was no other option. Before the ambulance doors closed, Michael's head lifted weakly. His eyes found Amara, and he reached out feebly. "Amara, I'm sorry." The girl didn't respond, her expression unreadable as she watched the ambulance pull away. Daniel stood beside her, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Let's get you somewhere safe for the night," he said. She didn't protest, allowing him to guide her to his cruiser. As he buckled her into the passenger seat, her fingers brushed his hand. He looked down to see her signing again, slow and deliberate. "Help him," she signed. Daniel nodded, the weight of her trust pressing heavily on his chest. "I will," he promised. "I won't let him down." With that, he started the car, the glow of the ambulance's taillights fading into the distance as they drove toward an uncertain future. The drive back into town was quiet, save for the rhythmic hum of the cruiser's engine. Amara sat in the passenger seat, her small hands folded tightly around the frayed edge of her teddy bear's paw. Her wide eyes remained fixed on the road ahead, unfocused and distant, as though she was bracing herself for whatever came next. Daniel glanced at her occasionally, weighing the storm of questions building in his mind against her visible exhaustion. The night had taken its toll on both of them. He pulled into the parking lot of the local Child Protective Services CPS office, a plain brick building that looked lifeless in the dim glow of the streetlights. It wasn't the most welcoming place, but it was safe. Daniel parked and turned to Amara, softening his voice. "This is just for tonight," he said. "You'll stay here while we figure everything out. I promise you're not alone in this." Amara didn't respond, but her fingers twitched as if she wanted to sign something. Instead, she simply nodded and gripped the bear tighter. Daniel sighed inwardly, wishing he could do more to ease her fear. A social worker named Elaine met them at the entrance. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a calm demeanor, her clipboard tucked under one arm. She crouched to Amara's level, offering a warm smile. "Hi, sweetheart. My name's Elaine," she said gently. "We're going to make sure you're comfortable tonight, okay?" Amara hesitated, glancing at Daniel before giving another small nod. Elaine led her inside, her soft reassurances fading as the door closed behind them. Daniel lingered on the steps for a moment, the weight of the night pressing down on him. He knew his work wasn't done, not by a long shot. He returned to his cruiser and drove to the hospital where Michael had been taken. The waiting room was a sterile, fluorescent-lit space that smelled faintly of disinfectant. Daniel approached the nurse at the front desk and flashed his badge. "I'm here to check on Michael Harrison. He was brought in from an accident earlier tonight." The nurse typed briskly on her keyboard before nodding. "He's stable. They're running some tests, but he's awake. Room 314. Daniel made his way down the quiet corridors, his footsteps echoing against the tiled floors. When he reached the room, he paused outside the door, gathering his thoughts. He needed answers, and Michael was the only one who could provide them. Taking a steadying breath, he stepped inside. Michael was propped up in bed, his face pale and drawn. A bandage covered the cut on his temple, and his eyes were bloodshot. He looked up as Daniel entered, his expression shifting from confusion to weariness. "Officer," Michael said, his voice hoarse, Is Amara okay?" "She's safe," Daniel replied, pulling up a chair. "She's with Child Protective Services for the night." Michael winced, his hand gripping the edge of the blanket. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. He broke off, his gaze dropping to his lap. "I've been trying, but it's hard." Daniel studied him for a moment, noting the deep lines etched into his face, the tremor in his hands. "Tell me what's going on, Michael. I need to understand." Michael sighed heavily, leaning back against the pillows. "It's been rough since Evelyn passed," he admitted. "She was my anchor. When she got sick, I tried to hold everything together for Amara, but after she died, I couldn't keep up. The bills piled up, I lost my job. I started hearing things, seeing things that weren't there." His voice cracked, and he rubbed a hand over his face. "I know I've scared her. I've failed her, but I love my daughter. I'd never hurt her." The sincerity in Michael's voice was impossible to ignore, but so was the weight of his confession. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his tone steady but firm. "She signaled for help, Michael. She's scared. You might not mean to hurt her, but your actions, your instability, are putting her in danger." Michael's shoulders sagged, the truth of Daniel's words hitting him hard. "I know," he whispered. "I know." Daniel sat back, his mind racing. It was clear that Michael wasn't malicious, but his condition was a serious problem. "Have you sought help? Therapy? Medication?" Michael shook his head. "I've been too ashamed. People already look at me like I'm broken. I didn't want them to think I couldn't take care of my own child." "Getting help doesn't make you weak," Daniel said firmly. "It's the only way you're going to get through this, and the only way to keep Amara safe." Michael didn't respond, but his silence felt like a small concession. The following morning, Daniel sat in his office at the station, poring over Michael's background. He dug through public records, reaching out to colleagues and old contacts for information. Michael's story checked out. He had been a devoted husband and father before Evelyn's death. The neighbors described him as a quiet, hard-working man who adored his wife and daughter. But after Evelyn's passing, things took a downward spiral. Late-night arguments with himself, sudden absences from work, and a growing list of unpaid bills painted a grim picture. Daniel also discovered that Evelyn had been the cornerstone of their family. She was a teacher, beloved by her students, and an advocate for foster children. The loss of someone so vibrant and steady would have shaken anyone, let alone a man unprepared to shoulder the weight of grief alone. As he compiled the information, a call came in from Elaine at CPS. "Officer Rivers, I thought you should know that Amara opened up a bit this morning. She told me about some of the things Michael's been saying. The voices he hears, the fear he has that someone is going to take her away. She doesn't feel safe, but she also doesn't want to lose him. It's complicated." Daniel closed his eyes briefly, the ache in his chest growing. "Thanks for letting me know. I'll be in touch." Hanging up, he sat back, his thoughts swirling. Michael was a man on the edge, but he wasn't beyond saving. Amara's loyalty to her father was clear, even amid her fear. The bond between them was strong, but it was strained to its breaking point. Daniel knew what he had to do. Later that day, Daniel returned to the hospital, armed with the information he'd gathered. He found Michael sitting up in bed, staring blankly out the window. The man's fatigue was palpable, but there was a flicker of hope in his eyes when he saw Daniel. "I've been doing some digging," Daniel said, pulling a chair up to the bedside. "You have people who care about you, Michael. People who remember the man you were before all this. They want you to succeed, and so does Amara." Michael's eyes widened slightly at the mention of his daughter. "She still trusts me?" "She wants to," Daniel said carefully. "But trust isn't just about words, it's about action. You need help, Michael. Professional help. Therapy, medication, whatever it takes to get you back on your feet." Michael swallowed hard, his hands trembling in his lap. "And if I don't?" "Then you risk losing her for good," Daniel said bluntly. "I'm not saying this to scare you. I'm saying it because you still have a chance to make things right. But you have to take that step." Michael nodded slowly, tears welling in his eyes. "I'll do it," he said hoarsely. "For her. For Amara." It wasn't a solution, but it was a start, and for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt like he was helping to piece together something broken, rather than just documenting its fall. Michael's quiet commitment to seeking help was a pivotal moment, but for Daniel, it was only the beginning of a long road. Promises were easy to make when desperation loomed, but keeping them required strength and consistency, traits that had eroded under the weight of Michael's grief and instability. As Daniel left the hospital that day, the gravity of the situation settled heavily on him. Amara's safety depended on her father's ability to heal, and there was no room for failure. The next morning, Daniel returned to the station to begin the next steps. He reached out to local social services and mental health professionals, leveraging every contact he had. If Michael was serious about change, Daniel would ensure he had the resources to make it happen. Therapy sessions, medication plans, and a structured routine were all critical pieces of the puzzle. The first challenge, however, was ensuring Michael could maintain custody of Amara while proving he was capable of caring for her. Child Protective Services was hesitant. Amara's safety was their top priority, and they needed concrete evidence that Michael was stable enough to provide a secure environment. Daniel met with Elaine from CPS later that afternoon in her small, cluttered office. The walls were lined with binders and paperwork, a testament to the countless families who had passed through her care. She offered him a tired smile as he entered. "Officer Rivers, I appreciate your involvement," Elaine said, gesturing for him to sit. "But I hope you understand how delicate this situation is. We can't take risks with Amara's well-being." "I understand," Daniel said, his tone resolute. "But I've spoken with Michael. He's agreed to start therapy and take steps to address his mental health. He knows what's at stake." Elaine folded her hands on the desk, her expression thoughtful. "That's a good start, but it's not enough. We need to see progress, measurable, sustained progress. Until then, Amara will remain in temporary care." Daniel nodded. "Fair enough. I'll work with him to make sure he follows through." Elaine sighed. "You're putting a lot of faith in this man." "I've seen worse situations turn around," Daniel replied, "and I'm not giving up on him or his daughter." Over the next several weeks, Michael began attending therapy sessions twice a week. The sessions were grueling at first, dredging up painful memories of Evelyn's illness and the guilt he carried over his perceived failures as a husband and father. His therapist, Dr. Hayes, was patient but firm, guiding him through the tangled web of his grief and fears. Daniel made it a point to check in with Michael regularly, visiting him at his apartment, a modest, somewhat cluttered space that spoke of a life interrupted. He noticed small signs of improvement: dishes washed and put away, the blinds drawn to let in sunlight, a few family photos dusted and placed prominently on the shelves. During one visit, Michael gestured to a picture of Evelyn and Amara, taken at a park years earlier. Evelyn's warm smile and Amara's carefree laugh seemed like echoes of a distant past. "She was the glue that held us together," Michael said quietly, his fingers brushing the frame. "I always thought I'd be strong enough to handle anything for Amara, but when Evelyn died—" His voice trailed off, his eyes misting. "You're stronger than you think," Daniel said, "and you're showing that by doing the work now. Amara needs you, but she also needs you to be stable." Michael nodded, his jaw tightening. "I won't let her down again." Meanwhile, Amara was adjusting to life in temporary foster care. She stayed with a kind couple, the Millers, who had experience fostering children. Their home was warm and inviting, filled with the sense of home-cooked meals and the sound of gentle conversation. Despite their best efforts to make her comfortable, Amara remained reserved, her interactions limited to polite nods and brief answers. Daniel visited her frequently, ensuring she felt supported. During one visit, he found her sitting at the dining table, drawing quietly with a set of colored pencils. Her teddy bear sat beside her, its worn fur a constant source of comfort. "Hey, Amara," Daniel said, pulling up a chair. "What are you working on?" She glanced at him before holding up the paper. It was a drawing of a house with a small girl standing in the doorway. The girl held hands with two figures, a man and a woman. The woman had curly hair and a warm smile. "That's your mom and dad?" Daniel asked gently. Amara nodded, her eyes flickering with a mix of sadness and longing. "They love you very much," Daniel said. "Your dad is working really hard right now because he wants to be the best he can for you." Amara hesitated before signing. "Does he still hear the voices?" Daniel paused, carefully choosing his words. "He's getting help for that. It's going to take time, but he's doing it because he wants to make things better for you." She studied him for a moment before signing again. "I miss him." Daniel's chest tightened. "He misses you too," he said, "and he's doing everything he can to bring you home." As the weeks turned into months, Michael's progress became increasingly evident. His therapy sessions were consistent, and he began taking medication to manage his symptoms. He also started attending a support group for widowed parents, finding solace in the shared experiences of others who had faced similar struggles. Dr. Hayes provided regular updates to CPS, noting Michael's commitment to the process and his gradual improvement. Elaine began to soften her stance, agreeing to supervised visits between Michael and Amara. The first visit took place in a neutral setting, a bright, cheerful room at the CPS office filled with toys and books. Daniel was present, his role both supportive and observational. Michael arrived first, his nervous energy palpable as he paced the room. When Amara entered, clutching her teddy bear, he froze, his eyes welling with tears. "Amara," he whispered, kneeling to her level. "Hi, sweetheart." She hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and Daniel before taking a cautious step forward. Michael opened his arms, and after a moment's hesitation she ran into them, burying her face in his chest. "I missed you so much," he murmured, holding her tightly. "I'm so sorry, baby. I'm going to do better, I promise." Daniel watched the scene unfold, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It was a small victory, but a meaningful one. The visits became more frequent, each one building trust and rekindling the bond between father and daughter. Amara began to open up, sharing stories about her foster home and showing Michael her drawings. He listened intently, his attention fully on her in a way that seemed to heal some of the fractures in their relationship. For Daniel, witnessing their progress was both rewarding and humbling. He knew there were no guarantees, but he also knew that love and determination had the power to overcome even the deepest wounds. As Michael continued to prove himself, Elaine and CPS began discussing the possibility of reuniting him with Amara. It would be a gradual process, monitored closely to ensure her safety and well-being. The final decision, however, rested with the family court, which would convene in a few weeks. Daniel felt a renewed sense of purpose as he prepared to testify on Michael's behalf. He believed in the man's capacity for change and the importance of keeping families together whenever possible. Amara deserved a stable, loving home, and he was determined to help her find it. The courtroom was a study in contrasts. Bright fluorescent lights illuminated the space, yet a palpable heaviness hung in the air. Rows of wooden benches creaked as people shifted nervously in their seats. At the front of the room, a somber-faced judge presided over the proceedings, her gavel resting silently on the polished surface of the bench. Daniel sat near the back, his heart pounding despite his calm exterior. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment, ensuring every piece of evidence and testimony was in place to support Michael Harrison's case. This hearing was critical. It would determine whether Michael would regain custody of Amara or if she would remain in the foster system indefinitely. Michael sat at the defendant's table, his posture stiff and his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He wore a neatly pressed suit, the first sign of his growing stability. His face was a mixture of determination and anxiety, his eyes darting toward the door every few moments, as if willing Amara to appear. To his right, Elaine from CPS sat with a folder brimming with reports. She offered Michael a reassuring nod, though her expression remained professional. On the other side of the room, Amara sat quietly beside her temporary foster mother, Mrs. Miller. The little girl clutched her teddy bear, her wide eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. She looked so small in the vastness of the courtroom, a stark reminder of the stakes. When the judge called the hearing to order, the room fell silent. The proceedings began with a review of the case file. The CPS attorney outlined the events leading up to the hearing: Evelyn Harrison's death, Michael's subsequent instability, the car accident, and Amara's temporary placement in foster care. It was a damning timeline, but one that also included a glimmer of hope: Michael's efforts to seek help and rebuild his life. The first witness called to testify was Dr. Hayes, Michael's therapist. The seasoned psychologist adjusted his glasses as he took the stand, his calm demeanor commanding attention. "Dr. Hayes," the CPS attorney began, "can you speak to Mr. Harrison's progress in therapy?" "Of course," Dr. Hayes replied. "When Mr. Harrison first came to me, he was in a state of deep psychological distress. He had unresolved grief over the loss of his wife, compounded by financial and emotional pressures. However, over the past few months, he has shown remarkable commitment to his treatment. He has attended every scheduled session, adhered to his prescribed medication regimen, and actively engaged in therapeutic exercises designed to manage his symptoms. Would you say he is fit to resume full custody of his daughter?" the attorney pressed. Dr. Hayes hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "I believe Mr. Harrison is on a path toward stability. While he still has work to do, his progress indicates that he is capable of providing a safe and nurturing environment for his daughter, provided there is ongoing support." The attorney nodded and returned to her seat. Michael's attorney took the opportunity to emphasize Dr. Hayes' testimony, asking questions that highlighted Michael's dedication to change. By the time Dr. Hayes stepped down, it was clear his testimony had made an impact. Next, Elaine was called to the stand. As a veteran social worker, she was no stranger to courtrooms, yet the weight of this case seemed to bear heavily on her shoulders. "Miss Elaine," the judge said, her tone even, "you've worked closely with both Mr. Harrison and his daughter. What is your professional assessment of their situation?" Elaine took a deep breath before responding. "Amara is a resilient child, but she has experienced significant trauma. Her bond with her father is evident. Despite her fears, she clearly loves him and wants to be with him. In my interactions with Mr. Harrison, I've seen a man who is genuinely committed to bettering himself for his daughter's sake. He has made significant strides in his mental health, and I believe reunification is in Amara's best interest, provided there are safeguards in place." The CPS attorney questioned her thoroughly, probing for any lingering doubts about Michael's ability to parent effectively. Elaine remained firm, emphasizing the importance of family and the progress she had witnessed. Finally, it was Daniel's turn. As he took the stand, he felt the weight of the room's attention settle on him. His uniform added an air of authority, but he knew his words carried even greater weight. He wasn't just a cop today. He was an advocate. Officer Rivers, the CPS attorney, began. You were the first responder on the night of the car accident involving Mr. Harrison and his daughter. Can you describe your observations? Daniel recounted the events of that night, the erratic driving, the crash, and Amara's silent SOS. He described Michael's initial instability and the steps that had been taken since then. And, in your professional opinion, the attorney continued, do you believe Mr. Harrison poses a danger to his daughter? No, Daniel said firmly. I believe Michael Harrison was a man in crisis, but he's taken responsibility for his actions and sought the help he needed. I've seen him fight to regain control of his life, not for himself, but for his daughter. That speaks volumes about his character. The hearing stretched on for hours, each argument carefully weighed. The judge listened intently, her expression unreadable as the attorneys presented their closing statements. When the final arguments were made, she called for a brief recess to deliberate. Michael sat in silence during the break, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Daniel placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder as he passed, offering a quiet, "You've done everything you can." Amara sat with Mrs. Miller, her gaze fixed on her father. She didn't fidget or look away, her focus unwavering. For all her quietness, she seemed to radiate a quiet strength, as though she understood the gravity of what was happening. When the judge returned, the courtroom fell silent. She took her seat and opened the case file in front of her, flipping through the pages deliberately before addressing the room. "This is not a decision I make lightly," she began. "The well-being of the child is paramount, and every piece of evidence must be weighed carefully. After reviewing the testimony and documentation provided, I find that Mr. Harrison has demonstrated a significant commitment to improving his circumstances. He has taken tangible steps to address his mental health and provide a safe environment for his daughter." Michael exhaled audibly, his shoulders sagging with relief. The judge raised a hand, cutting through the murmurs of the courtroom. "However," she continued, "this reunification will not be without conditions. Mr. Harrison will be required to continue therapy and adhere to all recommendations from his healthcare providers. Regular check-ins with Child Protective Services will be mandatory for the next 6 months. Should there be any concerns about Amara's safety, this case will be reevaluated." Michael nodded vigorously, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Your Honor. I won't let you down." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of adjustments. Amara moved back into her father's apartment, which had undergone a transformation. The clutter was gone, replaced with warmth and order. Her bedroom was painted in soft pastels, adorned with new sheets and curtains that let in the morning sun. Michael continued his therapy sessions, and Daniel checked in regularly, becoming a fixture in their lives. Amara began to smile more, her laughter occasionally filling the small apartment. The road ahead was still challenging, but it was one they were walking together. For Daniel, watching their journey was a reminder of why he wore the badge. It wasn't just about enforcing laws, it was about protecting and rebuilding lives. And for Michael and Amara, it was a second chance they intended to make the most of. The first morning after Amara's return home dawned with a soft golden light that filtered through her freshly hung curtains. Michael stood quietly in the doorway of her room, watching as she stirred in her bed. The teddy bear she had clung to so tightly during their months apart was now tucked under her arm, its head peeking out from the covers. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Michael allowed himself a small smile. His daughter was home. Downstairs, the kitchen was alive with the scent of scrambled eggs and toast. Michael had woken early, determined to start the day on a positive note. He moved with careful precision, arranging the plates and setting the table as though the act itself could keep the fragile balance of their newfound stability. The routine was grounding, a tangible sign that life was finding its rhythm again. When Amara finally came downstairs, her steps were tentative, her eyes scanning the room as if expecting something to go wrong. Michael turned from the stove, his smile widening. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, keeping his voice light. "Breakfast is almost ready. Sit wherever you'd like." Amara hesitated before sliding into a chair, her small hands resting in her lap. She watched as Michael placed a plate of eggs and toast in front of her, followed by a glass of orange juice. The sight of her father cooking, something she hadn't seen in so long, seemed to ease some of her tension. "Do you still like your eggs scrambled?" Michael asked, his tone cautious. Amara nodded, a flicker of a smile touching her lips. "Yes," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Hearing her speak filled Michael with a mixture of relief and determination. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but moments like this gave him hope. Later that morning, they ventured outside to the small park down the street. Michael had made a habit of avoiding it in the months after Evelyn's death. It had been one of her favorite places to take Amara. But today felt different. Today was about moving forward. Amara clutched his hand tightly as they walked along the winding path. The park was quiet, save for the distant sound of birds chirping and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. They reached a bench near the playground, and Michael gestured for her to sit. "Do you remember the swings?" he asked, pointing to the set just a few feet away. "You used to spend hours on those." Amara glanced at the swings, then back at her father. Her grip on his hand loosened slightly. "You pushed me really high once," she said, a faint smile breaking through. Michael chuckled. "You screamed like you were on a roller coaster, but you kept asking for more." For a moment, they sat in silence, the memories easing the tension between them. Then Amara looked up at him, her wide eyes filled with a question she seemed hesitant to ask. "Will you be okay this time?" she finally said. Michael's breath hitched. He knelt in front of her, taking both of her hands in his. "I'm trying, sweetheart. I promise I'll do everything I can to be okay. For you, you're my whole world." Amara nodded, her gaze steady. "I believe you." As the days turned into weeks, their routine began to solidify. Michael attended his therapy sessions diligently, often discussing his progress with Amara in ways she could understand. He wanted her to see that he was making an effort, not just for her, but for himself. Amara, in turn, began to open up more. She started drawing again, filling sketch pads with colorful images of her and her father. One day, she presented him with a picture of their family, including Evelyn, smiling down at them from a cloud. Michael held back tears as he carefully pinned the drawing to the refrigerator. Daniel remained a steady presence in their lives, stopping by frequently to check on their progress. His visits often coincided with dinner, where he and Amara would share stories while Michael cooked. Amara had grown to trust him deeply, and Michael was grateful for the support. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the living room in a warm, amber glow, Michael and Amara sat on the couch, going through an old photo album. The pages were filled with pictures of happier times, birthdays, family vacations, and quiet moments captured in Evelyn's meticulous handwriting on the back of each photograph. Amara pointed to a picture of herself as a toddler, perched on Evelyn's lap with a wide, toothless grin. "She used to sing to me," Amara said softly. "I miss her songs." Michael's throat tightened, but he forced himself to smile. "She had the most beautiful voice," he agreed. "She used to sing to both of us." Amara leaned against him, her small frame fitting perfectly into his side. "Do you think she's watching us?" Michael wrapped an arm around her, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I know she is. And I think she'd be really proud of you." The day of their final CPS review arrived sooner than Michael had expected. Elaine arrived at their home in the afternoon, her clipboard in hand and her expression kind but professional. Michael greeted her at the door, his nerves evident in the tightness of his smile. Over the next hour, Elaine observed their interactions, asking questions and taking notes. Amara answered with confidence, her trust in her father clear in the way she spoke about him. Michael remained calm, his responses honest and reflective. When Elaine finally closed her clipboard, she looked at Michael with a small smile. "You've come a long way," she said. "I'll be recommending that the oversight period end early. I believe you're ready to move forward without additional supervision." Michael's relief was palpable. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Elaine knelt to Amara's level. "You've been so brave, sweetheart. Your dad is very lucky to have you." Amara smiled shyly, glancing up at her father. "I'm lucky too." That evening, they celebrated with a quiet dinner at home. Amara insisted on helping Michael cook, her laughter filling the kitchen as she spilled flour on the counter. By the time they sat down to eat, the air between them was light, the weight of the past months finally lifting. After dinner, they ventured back to the park. The sky was painted with hues of orange and pink as the sun set, casting long shadows across the grass. Amara ran ahead to the swings, her joy infectious as she called for Michael to push her. As he stood behind her, gently pushing her higher and higher, Michael felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The darkness that had once consumed him no longer felt insurmountable. He had found his way back to the light, back to the family he thought he had lost. When Amara finally tired, they sat together on the bench, watching the stars begin to appear in the night sky. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her voice soft as she spoke. "We're okay now, right?" she asked. Michael kissed the top of her head, his answer unwavering. "We're more than okay. We're a team." And as the stars shone down on them, Michael knew they had found their new beginning, a life rebuilt from love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his daughter. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. Share this video with your friends and family. It means the world to us and helps us bring more stories to life. And if you're curious about our other videos, check them out. We have plenty more to explore. See you in the next one.